said earlier to a young woman who works diligently here in and around Rutgers, devoted to the city of Newark, that I'm nervous that the 30-somethings who are taking their leadership responsibility in Newark now don't have the benefit until now of what is revealed in this volume. I don't want to embarrass the editors, but I will say they have done a yeoman's job of cataloging what is vital for us if we are to forge a really progressive new future, continue forging a progressive new future for this city. In many ways, when I read this book, and I urge you to think about these analogies when you plow through it, for those of you who haven't read it. The images, there are two images, is that Ken Gibson and those working closely with him were like people drinking from a fire hose. And I think about that because of the expectations of the masses of Ken Gibson's supporters, people marginalized by so many variables, and what they expected of this mayor. Not just expected over time, but a couple of days after the election. And on the other hand, to sort of paraphrase or utilize unfairly that well-known expression, Gil Scott-Heron, the revolution will not be televised, right? Well, the revolution will not be brought on by a single election. And I think Ken Gibson faced the lack of real understanding on the part of people whose lives were urgently on the edge, and not really understanding that. Not understanding, for example, that Newark is not an island, and a city with great needs would have to reach beyond its borders for help. And that thing about him being a mayor for all the people didn't resonate so, what do you say, resonate so much to the people living in high-rise apartments, people who were struggling with life. But he had to contend with this. Do you have a palpable sense of those days of high expectation imposed upon the limits? Because as I read the reflection, I'm reminded of the fable of the 6 blind men and the elephant. You read all of these different views of Ken Gibson, and as the fable suggests, it really depended on where you touched him that defined how you saw him. And that's why having all of these voices together is a brilliant stroke.
Made lots of sense.
Expectations, limitations.
Bill, perhaps I can pick up the theme where you use the word fable. A Greek fabulist, Aesop, once said, "He who seeks to please everyone." But when we say a mayor for all the people, I don't think Ken was naive about Aesop's theme that you can't please everyone. He was comfortable with not pleasing anyone so long as he was taking care of his city. And I think that gesture summarizes his legacy as well as I can in terms of what his commitment was to the city of Newark.
So Richard, how did you and Bob decide to go about establishing this record in the way that you did?
It's an interesting development. Actually, the germ of this idea originated with Bob Holmes and the guy by the name of George Hampton. Mm-hmm. They were discussing...
A guy by the name of George Hampton.
Yeah, a guy by the name of George Hampton. They were discussing what might be done to begin to address some of the more critical commentary that was prevalent in the conversation about Newark. And I got involved in this conversation over the course of a glass of wine or a bottle of beer at the steakhouse on Route 21 here in Newark. And the decision moved in the direction of writing an article for a major magazine like Governing to talk about what had happened almost 50 years ago now. That is, the tenure of Ken Gibson, the first African-American mayor of this city, who strove to infuse it with economic help, if you will, to respond to some of the challenges that the people who happened to be marginalized were addressing at the time. And that conversation continued, leading to us deciding that perhaps the best way to go about writing about that period would be to enlist the involvement of others who were active in the city, either as a part of the administration or critics of the administration or friends of the administration, to get a cross-section of views about what actually happened during the period that Ken Gibson was mayor. We were going to produce a volume that we would publish ourselves. We would self-publish this document, we thought. And to our surprise, it was suggested that we reach out to Rutgers University Press to determine its interest in taking the lead in publishing the volume. And quite frankly, Bob and I were even more surprised when they said they wanted to run with it. They thought it was a terrific idea. So that's how it began. And over the course of 2 years, we recruited, Bob can add to this, we recruited some 44 individuals who we asked to chat in writing about their experience in Newark during the period that Ken Gibson was mayor, during his first term, his second term, his third term, and his fourth term. We asked them to write from their perspective about things they felt were important, about their relationship to Ken, about their individual involvement in the city, their hopes for the city at that time, their expectations, and their sense of failure, if you will. Over the course of those 2 years, we were able to convince 44 people that they should join us in this project.
We are the collective memory of the time. So as you read it, don't read it as a book just about Ken Gibson, but a book about the time that Ken Gibson served as mayor, the place in which Ken Gibson served as mayor, through the voices and the eyes of the many people that we got to talk about it. People like Dave Dennison, who was really right in the core of that administration during that period, Junius Williams and others who contributed to this volume. Marie Villani, I can't, so delighted to see you, who was there on the council trying to support him while she sat between the white council and the African American council and found herself as the one woman that had to somehow bridge that gap. The voices are extraordinary. So it's the collective memory that we hope to capture about the man, the time, and the place all in one volume.
See, one thing I thought about knowing these gentlemen is getting a group of engaged citizens to give their own perspectives on Gibson would relieve them of responsibility for letting us know what they think. So I'm going to push them a little bit since they've been privy to all the material and they've digested it beautifully, to do some speculation and some opining on certain aspects. Now, one of the things that pops up in the book is this debate about Ken's personality. He was notoriously low-key and deliberate. And on the other hand, there were people who thought, in hindsight maybe, even in foresight, Newark needed a, forgive my bias, a firebrand, a charismatic person. And there were people who wrote, who felt positive about Ken's style, and there were those who wondered what might have been had he been more, I think you even used, or someone used, the term like a Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton. I'm not making that up, it's in the book. So would you say a few words about that? Because it is an ingredient in what was accomplished or not.
Yeah, I think the press, especially the New York Times, led in the conversation about Ken's personality, that he was very low-keyed, that he was laid back, reserved. In fact, I think, they said he was phlegmatic, if you will. That, I think, was intended to be a backhanded compliment to the mayor, because I think others came to the conclusion that Ken's quietness, if you will, was an advantage for a city that had just 3 years prior to that experienced one of the largest and most traumatic citizen rebellions in the country. So having someone who could, if you will, stabilize the residents of this community, those who were very much concerned about what they had not been allowed to participate in, the city's economy, the workforce, in government, and those who were protecting, if you will, the power and resources they had been able to capture as a result of their having led the city for many years. So this quiet personality sought to bridge those two communities, if you will. His personality worked for a group of people who were concerned about bringing those different communities together. For those who felt, however, that electing a black mayor implied that there was a new day in Newark, that there would be a dramatic change in the lifestyle and the quality of life and the conduct of business. And some felt that Ken's style did not allow for that to be realized. You want to add?
One thing, a name that comes to mind, a contributor to the book, the late Al Coppi, suggests that Ken's strength was underestimated. And he puts it in this context. He said he was a mayor who came downtown to the business community and introduced himself as one of the CEOs in this town. He is the chief executive officer of a municipal corporation known as the City of Newark, and stood toe-to-toe with the CEOs of Prudential, PSE&G, and all of the others. And Al Coppi thought he was one of the first to take the mayor's office and put it in that context, that he too was a chief executive officer who should be respected. And it made a huge difference in the city because those major corporations were important to the revitalization of the city. So he may have been laid back and quiet, but people like Al Coppi tell us in the book that he was no shrinking violet. He could stand his ground, and he could stand his ground with the best of them.
How do you understand change? I mean, are we not still living in an era greatly influenced by Ken Gibson on a trajectory of change that occurs over a generation or more? Is that too polite? Because, Richard, you articulate some pretty impressive things that were accomplished, that were initiated in those days.
Yeah, I think the mayor does not get as much credit as he should for maybe 3 or 4 principal things, and Bob will add to this, I'm sure. The first of which is the extent to which he was able to enlist the involvement and the participation of young African American and, dare I say, majority public policy aficionados, if you will, who wanted to participate in the rebuilding of Newark led by an African American mayor. He inspired these young people. They came from some of the most prestigious institutions in the country, from Yale and Harvard and Princeton and Rutgers and Seton Hall and you name it. These young men, primarily young men, by the way, became a part of his administration. They worked in the nonprofit organizations that supported government services. So that was a contribution that doesn't, in my view, get as much attention as it should have. Many of those young men have moved on to very prominent positions in important places across.
they are alumni of Gibson University.
Of Gibson University.
Let's talk a little bit about that and the place of these alumni today and how that is relevant to where Newark is today.
I think I coined that phrase, Gibson
Yeah, you
University,
did.
feeling
That's
that
why I'm
I,
looking at you, sir. Yeah.
that I am one of the graduates of that distinguished university known as Gibson University. I think it's Dan O'Flaherty's piece that reminds us, Dr. Howard, that having change is like watching grass grow.
Yeah.
You got to be very
Yes,
patient, and you have to look at it from a distance. Perhaps if you stand there and watch it, you probably won't notice the paint dry or the grass grow. And that's going to be the legacy of Ken Gibson. We have to continue to evaluate it over time, looking back at it and how it has affected things we see today. I researched how historians determine whether a person is an historic figure. It's those who leave traces of themselves behind. And to your metaphor that Sharp James used, those who lay the foundation for others to build upon. And upon those tests, Ken Gibson wins hands down. He is clearly an historic figure because he satisfies all of those tests for what an historic figure needs to be. I might add, though, that I think what I learned from the historians best describing Ken, when they were asked who they thought the most prominent and important mayor of all time would be, they named Fiorello LaGuardia of New York City. Why? For his programs and policies? No. It's because he changed the perception of what an Italian might be in a leadership role. There was a misperception that you were Cosa Nostra and Mafia. You were not going to be a mayor. Fiorello LaGuardia changed that perception. Ken Gibson had a much more difficult challenge to change the perception of what African Americans could do in a leadership role.
Yeah.
Some of our contributors described their childhood that they could never have imagined from their parents' voices ever seeing the city of Newark managed or run by an African American mayor. So it was his change of that perception. To Richard's point, one of my analogies, I hope you forgive me, you know, there were others changing perceptions. We didn't have black quarterbacks back then either.
Oh, my Lord.
When Marlon Briscoe came along and started for the Denver Broncos, he was changing a perception. Yeah, black men can manage a team and run a team.
I remember when Barack Obama was elected president, and that was the second or third American Revolution knocked. And so we've got to deal with constructively the tension between people's rightful expectations and demands of government alongside the structural limitations of what is possible. What you define, and you're telling us we have 3 minutes? Is that what you're telling us, Marcia?
I think
Let me finish the question.
yeah.
I mean, in the early pages, I think, Bob, maybe in your sort of earlier sort of introductory remarks, how much Newark needed help from places beyond Newark, sometimes in hostile places, juxtaposed to black cultural nationalism, you know, which was a current running through, and it still runs through Newark.
Still runs through Newark. Bill, let me give a quote that helps me summarize in one line how the challenge that faced the mayor could be expressed. Someone asked LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, what he thought the challenges of being the president of the United States would be. His remark was, it could be a lot worse, I could be a mayor. I thought that said it all.
Yeah.
This man believed, and I think he was probably right in some ways, that managing major cities at that time was a more challenging job. David Dinkins also points out, he says, Bob, Mayor Gibson had the same challenges I did, but think of the vast amount of resources I had in New York City as compared to what he had to work with against the same challenges here in the city of Newark. So LBJ, David Dinkins recognized that Ken Gibson hit a mountain of wall that he had to try to climb. And for us, having gone through this book, we think he climbed it quite well.
Yeah, I think the issue you raised about trying to gain a balance on the expectations and the realities you confront is something we should, in fact, try to get a handle on, but it's very difficult in the moment, you know, because you're faced with
real needs.
that's correct, and people who do have a right to expect that things will be changed, that things will change, and that they will change markedly, and that they will change at a steady, if not rapid, pace. That's understandable. The issue is how well you manage those expectations, and I believe Ken tried his best to manage those expectations. Some would say he was successful, others might say he was less so.
Well, the fact is now there could be, you know, reasons given for this, and detractors always have reasons. But the man served for 16 years. Were there re-elections, or did he just get elected first? So people saw something.
Yeah.
What did they see? Did they see?
I think in the first two terms, they saw calm reassurance that things may not change quickly, but that Ken wanted to move in a positive direction, a change direction. I think in the second two terms, they were less inclined to see his term in office that way. They were increasingly concerned about his inability to change things at the Newark public schools, about his inability to bring about economic revitalization of the city, the more active engagement on the part of especially the Latino community in the affairs of Newark. So I think that he got a bit tired in his fourth term in office, and as a consequence of that, the Newark populace decided that perhaps new blood was needed.
Yeah, I sense we're getting close to the end of our time, but look, I'm going to ask Richard. you asked a Baptist preacher to do this, so you know what I said? You asked a Baptist preacher to do this. So one last question, though, and Marsha's made me forget my question.
That was intentional.
I mean, where are we today, if this is a book about the future, given what you know about this past, the struggle, you know, the watershed, you know about that.
We could
It's
talk.
gone.
We could talk the rest of the evening about the Newark watershed.
But BGO is still here.
Ha-ha, right on.
You know,
BGO is still
and
here.
so on. I mean,
Yes.
Richard, you give quite a laundry list, and I sat up. I
Yeah,
said, wow.
right.
I mean, we still struggle with the schools, but there are some things we can point to.
But health
Where-
disparities has been greatly
Health
reduced
disparities, yes.
through our local health centers that Ken built, 7 or 8 of them, made a huge difference. We could talk about those.
Newark Emergency Services
Newark-
for Families.
Lots of things that he did.
So tell the millennials what their marching orders are in light of. That's a good way to end, right?
You got to keep struggling. You got to keep moving forward. You build on the work in the past. Use it as a platform for doing those things that you know need to be done to advance the community's interests as we go forward.
Newark Studies. Does it
Office of
continue
Newark
here?
Studies.
Does it continue here?
No, it's in a different form.
But is that Cornwall?
The
Or?
Cornwall Center is an attempt to replicate what the Office of Newark Studies attempted to do, but it's based in the guts of Rutgers-Newark, which is essential to its long-term success.
Well, I would like to propose, as the chancellors here and various deans, that we have a seminar on the trilogy to understand some of these things so that the new leadership coming forward will have the benefit of the elders' reflections. That's a serious proposal, that we have a graduate seminar, freshman seminar, I'm not sure which, but bringing from time to time contributors to come in and really help younger people know about Newark and how this era shines a light on the next. I knew Ken Gibson up close for the first time in 1984. Larry, when he chaired the state Jesse Jackson campaign. And I have to tell you, I said, man, I mean, we would sit there, we would talk about statewide strategy, and I had a good night's sleep. But there were times when I would doze off. He was soft-spoken, you know. But, you know, we were organized. He organized us, did he not? I thought about that. And I think these... now, when the great gospel, who am I talking about now? The great gospel, Precious Lord. Oh, we need a seminar on a lot of things. Huh? Dorothy. When he does that, Marcia, he's saying one more round. That's not what you need. Anyway, let's give these men a hand and all the people who helped them. Do you intend a few questions from the audience? Yes?
Yes.
And you're going to manage that.
I'm not sure how to follow that, so I won't even try. Again, I just want to thank you to both our moderator and the authors for just giving us a phenomenal talk this evening. Thank you again. So this time we have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience, and I will keep you on time. So, yeah, that's my job. So there are two mics that are sitting right here for those of you who have any questions, or we invite questions from the audience for any of our panelists. Councilman Grant, thank you for joining us.
No questions. That's great.
No questions? I find that hard to believe. I know some of you in this room. I was trying not to put them on the spot. No questions?
We could have gone on, see?
Dean Lopez, you need to use the mic, my friend, please. Mike. Yeah.
Here we go. There we go. Got to take the mic to the dean.
Take the mic to you.
All right, I'll be the icebreaker.
Thank you.
We're moving into 2020. As we understand, there's an election coming up, and it's one of the most monumental elections that we've faced in a long time. It's a federal election, and Ken Gibson is known for his work at the local level. What would Ken Gibson say to the people in this room about the future course of action as we move into 2020, about the possibilities of local action, about the possibilities of moving forward, given that this election may fork in one of two directions?
You know, Ken ran for office in 1966 for the office of mayor. He had no political experience. He was somewhat active in the Newark community, but he felt that he had a responsibility to step forward. He even, I think, knew that it was unlikely that he would be successful in that first attempt to gain the mayor's office. And he was willing to sacrifice himself, in a sense, on the altar of this effort, if you will, because it had to be done. I think he would say to the young people today that you've got to be willing to step forward and take on the challenge of addressing the issues you think need to be addressed, and to do so boldly, and not to be reluctant, not to wait for someone else to step forward to do it on your behalf. You've got to take the bull by the horns and try to make a difference. Bob?
Dean Lopez, I would say that Ken would make people understand that the role of big city mayors has changed dramatically. We don't have many nation states anymore. There aren't places where everyone in the place looks the same. We have diverse places, and that melting pot is most seen in our cities. So in effect, our mayors have become the avatars for policy and politics. So national politics can evolve out of cities. It's what the people in cities see the future of America is where America is going to go. So I think mayors like Ken would say, watch me. I'm going to tell you where the next generations of this country needs to be, because it is out of cities that the new direction for this country is going to emanate.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Could I, well, since we don't have any questions,
Yeah.
oh, there is one, okay. Oh, I got two
Ooh, you
now.
have two now.
They come
Really,
two
let's
by
go
two.
first and then you
I didn't realize he came from the South. What role do you think his Southern upbringing brought to his role as mayor of Newark?
Not much. He came to Newark when he was 8 years old.
Well,
So he
I'm
grew
talking
up.
about parental
Oh,
influence.
perhaps,
Yeah,
perhaps. That may have influenced. His willingness to be active in the civic arena was probably the residue of his having come from the South and his parents having brought him from the South and their determination to make a difference, both for themselves and for their community. So I assume that did have some relevance.
Okay, the second question is, what does his administration look like, considering he was dealing with a transition from a Italian administration to an African-American administration?
That was one of the challenges he confronted. He also inherited a $65 million budget deficit as he walked into the mayor's office. So his attempt to bring on new hires, to bring on new employees was constrained first by that reality, and second by the reality of the civil service requirements that precluded firing people without cause and bringing on new people. So he had to figure out a way to attract the talent that he sought in other ways. And he did it in two different streams, if you will. One was to attract federal and state dollars that would allow him to employ people outside of the civil service system after having negotiated with the state to, Dave Dennison can tell you more about this than I can, but to lower the requirements or to lengthen the time frame within which people could take the civil service exam so that they could be qualified to hold the jobs that he wanted them to have. So that was internal to city government, but he also created this thing called the Office of Newark Studies that brought into the administration, although they were not city employees, they were Rutgers University employees, to help him formulate policies, plans, and procedures that might be helpful to the city. So he took two different streams.
May I say one word in response to what you're saying? May I? That point about the economy, it was interesting because you noted that the inflation at that time actually helped the mayor solve the debt problem, but it hindered his capacity to attract capital. So it was a double whammy. My favorite story in the whole book was that some Italians broke into the mayor's office, broke down the door, okay? Broke down the door. He was inside, and they were armed. And if I'm not mistaken, maybe guns drawn.
Don't know about that, but they had guns.
But they had guns. And the mayor was sitting behind his desk, listening to them eating grapes. I mean, this is idiomatic of Kenneth Gibson's cool.
Yeah, but you got to remember when we chatted with Ken.
But you got to remember.
Got to remember when we chatted with Ken for his reflections.
Okay.
He reminded us that he sat there eating
wet his
grapes.
pants up.
No, he had his 38 in his lap.
You should have put that in there.
It's in there.
That's what he knows.
I missed that. Yeah.
That's
But he was
significant.
cool as a cucumber under these kinds of stressful
May I just
situations.
respond to Esther's question quickly? One of the other ways, Esther, and I can speak to it very directly, that he responded to the challenge that you raised, he created 3 separate nonprofit
entities.
entities to manage parts of city government. Junius can sit there and talk much more clearly about that because he was there helping to create them. HDRC, the Newark Housing Development Rehabilitation Corporation that I manage, the Newark NEDC, Newark Economic Development Corporation, Al Fayella's name resonates with that, And we can talk about the Newark Watershed Corporation, which I came back from state government to also manage, that I did 2 out of 3. To avoid that civil service conundrum that he faced, we ran parts of city government through outside nonprofit, quasi-governmental entities. I think Diane Johnson might want to comment on that. Roger Lowenstein commented on that it did create a bit of a splintering effect in city government. Diane, I think you had pointed out that it was difficult to find out where the head was. The head over here for this, there was another head over here. But what I found was interesting, how much autonomy the mayor was willing to give each of us in each of those roles. He trusted us to take on...
How old were you?
Right out of law school, I was very young. And he trusted us to take those roles on. And it probably created consternation for a person like you trying to manage us from HUD, because there were many heads. And you had to help figure out. But what you said, and I thought was very important, you said while it wasn't perhaps as well organized as it might have been, you thought each of those fiefdoms, if they were that, seemed to be run honestly. And I appreciated your comment about that in the book.
Thank you. Glenn, you had a question.
Well, my question is for you to ask a little more about Mayor Gibson's personality. There's so much emphasis on this calm demeanor, almost saintly. And it left me wondering, did he have some close associates that to whom he could cuss out imperiali, etc.? was there another side hidden there?
Juniors, what do you have to say about that? I think he had a few guys around him who he relied upon. I think of Elton Hill, for example, who became his... And Harry Wheeler, absolutely.
Also Harry Wheeler, yeah.
Junius was there for a while, and he helped in that regard. But I think those were the 2 principal players, Harry Wheeler and Elton Hill. Harry Wheeler was the CETA director, and Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver was his deputy for a while. How long were you there, Sheila?
About 4 years.
4 years, okay. So she knows about Harry Wheeler.
Well, we don't want to leave out Larry Coggins and others who were very instrumental in guiding the mayor in those early years.
I would like to see if contributors, want to add a little bit to, I think you'd agree with that, right?
Sure.
Yeah, if you want to add a little additional information or color. And I see one of the contributors standing now. Richard Camerari.
Sure is.
Again, good evening, everyone. Thank you all. I haven't had the benefit of reading the book yet, except my book. But put a little bit of a point on a couple of comments. I think it is important to re-emphasize what Richard was saying, that just because Ken got elected, we still had a neo-colonial economic dynamic, which things were controlled from the outside. We had an overwhelmingly white political infrastructure that didn't change, as you pointed out. So it was very difficult for Ken to do what he probably wanted to do. I do think there's, some of us, myself included, who thought he was a bit too cautious in his approach. I felt that in the 70s and 80s. Again, I was in my 20s and 30s. Of course, here's the point when I'm supposed to say, but I've changed my mind. But I still haven't. I do think he could have been a little less cautious in his, because, again, the socioeconomic distress, socioeconomics really didn't move much during his 4 terms, except for health indicators, which clearly he deserves credit for. My question is actually related to his relationship, his interaction with the female voices of the late 60s and 70s. I mean, there were, several, although, as usual, the women kind of get short shrift in these discussions. But I don't know if you want to talk about some of the women who were strong and powerful then, and what Ken's relationship was with them.
Why don't you name some of them?
Who we had? Pearl Beatty. People can throw them out here. Pearl Beatty.
Larry Stokes, Pearl Beatty.
Who was the, Edna Thomas, the radio show? Shirley.
Bernice Bass.
Bernice Bass.
So, the radio show.
That's my question. Thank you.
We may have just said it, Richard, that they were women who had an enormous impact on him and the way he managed things.
And some of whom he had a good, positive working relationship with. Others it was less so, quite frankly. Yes.
Well, I'm going to yield to Vincent. He was
Hi.
Hi,
Vincent.
I'm Vincent Perez. I was a contributor.
Yes.
My part of the contributor was his relation to the United Community Corporation. The United Community Corporation was created in 1965 under the All Economic Opportunity Act. It was the only organization in the city. Mayor Gibson came from UCC. So that's one of the things when they asked me to contribute, I would like to, because there has been a study done about UCC's contribution to the movement, because we were, at that time, was the only major social service organization in the city of Newark. We helped to fund, for example, we helped to fund Focus and other organizations in the city, and some of the players that you mentioned were part of the UCC movement. So I was very glad that when Richard invited me to speak about it, and I think it's something in the future you need to do some research, because it was the first agency in the city. It, as the only agency, had presence in the 5 wards of the city, and did some active community organizing that helped them. Because if you look into the report of the Newark riots, technically UCC was blamed.
Wow.
In that report that the state did, because it was the first organization.
This is a subject to be considered in that seminar, to go deeper.
Yeah.
Yes.
Really, I mean, this is vital. We can't.
I was very glad when I was invited to contribute to talk about that contribution, because I think when the Newark history comes out,
Yeah.
that has a part of
be a
Newark
part
has
of it.
never been discussed.
Thank you very much.
Vincent, very well said. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent.
Well,
Lieutenant
I just
Governor.
want to comment on Richard, because Richard, I was going to be good and
Uh-oh.
not comment on the fact that this discussion focused around the men that were part of the Gibson administration.
I acknowledge that.
Because there is no doubt there were significant numbers of women that worked in City Hall that kept the trains running on time. And I know, as a young person coming out of graduate school and returning to Newark, I got the opportunity to be exposed to some of those women. Some of them were formally educated, some of them were not. But I think the thing that we should not overlook, because I heard that we didn't move the city forward economically and we did not make progress in certain areas, I would challenge and dispute that thinking, because what Ken Gibson did, he created a black middle class in the city of Newark. He created a black middle class in this city, because I heard both of you say that prior to the election of Ken Gibson, there were no African Americans working in City Hall.
Right.
And that is absolutely the truth. But when Ken Gibson became the mayor, there was not an office in City Hall or those extensions of City Hall that were out in the community that were not staffed by African American people and Latino people as well. So I think, and then I like the question from the law school, Lopez. Ken Gibson's reach was further than Newark. I know that personally. He became the head of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and he used that platform to coalesce with mayors all around the country who were in the same boat that he was in. And they did form brain trusts and think tanks. And I can recall that when Coleman Young was mayor of Detroit, he brought parts of his staff from Newark, including myself, and we stayed holed up in rooms writing papers and authoring applications to bring resources into those cities. So I don't want us to leave here today thinking that Ken Gibson did not have economic impact, because many of us who are characterized as the generation or the mortar, or however Sharp described it, we would not have emerged as leaders in Newark had it not been for Ken Gibson's administration. We
agree with that.
Absolutely.
And you do touch upon this a bit. You touch upon this, but I think, like other subjects, the depth of Ken's reach beyond Newark has got to be a part of the seminar. It's touched upon in the book. The Conference of Mayors, the interaction with Stokes and those guys, right? It's all documented, but we need to go deeper, especially in light of ongoing experience. We've had more mayors Maybe the female mayor of Atlanta is benefiting from something Ken got started. We need to explore that, and I hope the academicians are picking up on my recommendation. I am, after all, a former Board of Governors guy.
We have our last question right here.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for bringing up the ladies here. Always powerful, always there at the if we're there at the table. I was noting, and maybe this is a figment of my imagination, because I was out during that same time period, but it seems like there were a lot of 20-somethings and maybe early 30-something at the table. I mean, I think we felt like we had a bigger seat at the table. You know, is that a figment, or were there, as a younger generation, have a little more clout, a little more seat at the table, listen to a little more, while perhaps the next generation, some, you know, kind of stood back?
Yeah,
And
I
watched?
think I made the point during my remarks that one of the things that Ken should be given more credit for is having brought into his administration and around him people who were in their mid to late 20s and early 30s, and who were given substantial substantive responsibilities. Bob Holmes and Jack Krosgoff and Richard Roper and a whole group of people like Jerome Harris and George Hampton, Junius Williams and Dave Dennison, all in their 30s, late 30s, mid 30s, if you will.
Junius was about 50 then.
No, he wasn't 50 then.
So you're saying we should be looking at replicating that?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, in conjunction with that, I think this thing that you're just referencing now, the young people involved and so on, I looked at this not to say putting aside other forms of struggle, but this was a new chapter.
Yep.
Taking over city government in a major American city, or American cities. This was the next wave. And I thought about that, Richard, when I saw Don Harris's name. Because Don Harris is straight out of SNCC. Now, he's a Rutgers guy, but he ducked bullets with me in Southwest Georgia.
There are two Don Harrises. One is in here, and the other is in Sarasota, Florida. The one
down in Florida.
Your Don Harris is in Sarasota.
Right. So it's interesting. And Junius came to Newark out of the Northern Student Movement, right? And SNCC orientation. Yeah, so this is like a different chapter in the ongoing struggle. And what is that struggle today, right? That's the question.